Good morning to you all. My name is Bob Groves. I'm the Provost at Georgetown, and on behalf of President DeGioia and my colleagues, we are honored to have you visit Georgetown on this day and to do your important work. I also note that this is a coalition of organizations that have made these 2 days happen. The McDonough School of Business Global Social Enterprises Initiative, the Georgetown Environment Initiative, the Secretary's Office itself, and Google and the Climate and Clean Energy Investment Forum. So this is a great example of what we pride ourselves about at Georgetown, in that we treasure partnerships as a way to move forward in this. So it's a great example of a multi-sector collaboration. We all look forward to an exciting day that hopefully will match or exceed that of yesterday. I won't dwell on the agenda, but I do want to note, as a way of thanking you for coming here, that this is just another way that we think at Georgetown to illustrate our commitment to science, to public discourse, to policy formation, and to institutional support for sustainable activities. This is something we take seriously here, and we have a lot of initiatives going on in a coordinated fashion to achieve those goals. So we are honored that you came to visit this little campus in Washington, D.C., and we wish you a wonderful, wonderful day, a set of stimulating conversations and great networking opportunities. Thank you.
Good morning. You all obviously have not had enough coffee this morning, and we set it all out for you early. Good morning. Good morning. Fantastic. Here we go. I hope you all have energy, because today is the work day. I am LaDon Mantegi. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Social Enterprise Initiative, and here at the McDonough School of Business, together with Bill Novelli, my colleague, who is the founder of the initiative, together with Tim Warren and Robin Dillon Merrill, who are the co-chairs of the Georgetown Environmental Initiative. We'd like to welcome you. Thanks for joining us here at Georgetown. We've got a robust day for you that our colleagues from the State Department have also collaborated on putting together. Whereas yesterday we had the great honor of hearing from Secretary Kerry, President DeGioia, Mr. Gratham, and several of you and others in terms of setting the stage in what is happening and what's necessary in climate and clean energy investment. Today is about breaking it down, and it is about really diving into how we do this, what your role is, and how we can take action individually, as organizations, and collectively in particular. To that end, I think it was really poignant when the Secretary said yesterday that when we consider climate change, it's really simple. It's about energy policy. And when we really think about how we move this forward, the one thing that really seems to resonate as an argument is the economics. And in terms of the investments and the business opportunities that exist for all of us, all of you, that's what we're here to talk about. To give us a refresher and to remind us of some of the key points, and for those of you who are just joining us today to really hear about what those points are, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Joanna Lewis, who is a professor here at Georgetown. Joanna is an associate professor of science, technology, and international affairs in the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. Her research focuses on energy, environment, and innovation in China, including renewable energy industry development and climate change policy. And Joanna has also been an advisor to the State Department on many of the issues that we've been discussing, and also very instrumental in working with the Global Partnerships Initiative Office out of the Office of the Secretary, as well as the State Department as we've put this conference together. Joanna has also written and been recognized recently for her book, Green Innovation in China, China's Wind Power Industry and the Global Transition to a Low-Carbon Economy. It was awarded the 2014 Harold and Margaret Spout Award by the International Studies Association for the Best Book of the Year in Environmental Studies. So if you'll join me in welcoming Joanna Lewis.
Thank you, LaDon. Good morning. So I have the job this morning to try to summarize yesterday's forum in about 3 minutes. So I thought I would just mention a few things that I heard yesterday that I found particularly notable. So Secretary Kerry kicked off the morning reminding us of the urgency of the climate challenge. And he said that a successful deal in Paris is so important that he plans to be on the ground for perhaps the entire 2 weeks, which is notable, I think, indeed. And then throughout the day, we heard about firsthand experiences in clean energy investment from a variety of perspectives. And overall, I think there was a lot of optimism, particularly for continued successes across both the developed and the developing world. We heard from businesses pioneering new approaches to clean energy development and challenging the dominant model of energy provision, including new ways to think about off-grid solutions in light of recent cost reductions in distributed technologies, and as well as in the wireless revolution, making even power lines increasingly obsolete. We heard from Secretary Kerry and others about a number of exciting investments in renewable energy projects in Africa, which are contributing to Power Africa's targets of enabling 30 gigawatts of new, cleaner generation. We heard from companies and governments working in emerging economies where infrastructure is more challenging and political risks must be managed, but the opportunities are significant for projects that could change the domestic energy landscape, particularly through what was called the demonstration effect. And we heard about examples of such projects, such as the 310 megawatt Lake Turkana wind power project in Kenya. While most investors noted they were technology agnostic throughout the day, solar, I think, clearly emerged as a technology with multiple benefits, both for on and off-grid applications. This is both, I think, due to recent price drops, and price drops that were emphasized that have happened not just in photovoltaics, but to some extent in storage, and particularly in efficient end-use technologies such as LED lighting, which makes solar go farther, as well as to solar's multifunctionality, referred to yesterday as Solar Plus. We heard from the private sector about the importance of the government, particularly in setting consistent policy, or even to ensure against inconsistent policies, with the example of OPEC's novel regulatory risk project, which includes changes in feed-in tariffs for renewable energy or carbon pricing, for example. We also heard from university presidents on the role of academia in the discovery and creation of new ideas, as well as educating new generations of leaders who are not just motivated, but even exhilarated by the challenge of climate change and particularly of finding solutions. So now that we are here at Georgetown for day 2 of the forum, let's hope that some of this exhilaration rubs off on us and inspires us to have another fruitful dialogue. I now have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker this morning, Hal Harvey, who has been one of the most influential leaders in philanthropy targeting clean energy solutions. Hal is the CEO of Energy Innovation and a senior fellow for energy and environment at the Paulson Institute. Previously, he was the founder and CEO of ClimateWorks Foundation and the environment program director at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And from 1990 to 2001, Hal served as founder and president of the Energy Foundation. Hal, thank you so much for joining us at Georgetown this morning, and I look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. It's terrific to be here, and I appreciate the kind introduction. I'm delighted, excuse me, that The focus yesterday was significantly on policy and how policies can drive change, because this is what I want to focus on myself today. Most people are focused on Paris. What I want to talk about is before Paris and after Paris, but not those brutal 2 weeks that will land in the middle. In some ways, we can declare Paris a success already. The commitments made by the United States of America, by China, by Europe, by a host of other countries are rather spectacular. They begin to put the world on a low-carbon trajectory. And in fact, if you add it all up, we went from a steady growth in emissions, if the Paris commitments are met, to roughly flat emissions. And then we have to think about declining emissions. You have to decline to close to zero to stabilize concentration at any given level. So for me, the question is, that if we can chalk up Paris as a success already, and I would argue that we can, what happens after Paris? How do these commitments get implemented? And how do they engender the next generation of policies and technologies and economics that are going to drive a low-carbon world? What I want to argue today is that there's a very small number of policies that are fantastically effective, and there's a large number that are essentially decorative, and that the way you design policy matters. There's a lot of private sector folks here. Anybody who's invested in the energy space in a serious way will understand that getting policy right makes all the difference in the world, and getting it wrong is a brutal handicap. First, a word about money. A lot of the Paris talks focuses on how to raise $100 billion to spend on clean energy technology as part of an aid package for lesser developed countries. To put that number in perspective, the world spends about $5 trillion per year on energy right now, and another $6 trillion per year on the infrastructure that sets our future energy patterns. So the cash flow, I would argue, is there. What matters for delivering a good future is whether that cash flow lands on green choices or brown choices. And that's policy's job. The other thing, which is a striking departure from all previous COPs, is that it now costs the same to build a green world as a brown world. It costs the same to get rid of carbon as to continue to produce carbon within an uncertainty band. The price of solar technologies, as everyone in this room knows, has dropped by 80% in the last 6 years. Wind has dropped by almost half. LEDs by another 80%. And as you begin to layer on things like large-scale data and better sensors, there's opportunities for system optimization in buildings, in industry, and in transportation, and in the electricity sector that have never existed before. So the point of all this is that we can land on a low-carbon future for the same price as a high-carbon future, but if and only if we get policies right. So, which policies matter? And just as important, how do you design those policies? I've had the good and great fortune of working on more than 100 policies that now are in existence in half a dozen countries in the last 25 years. And I've done a lot of studying of others and have uncovered, in my opinion, and I'm happy to defend this, about 10 that matter, and for all of them, a small number of design characteristics that either drive success or drive failure. So what matters? The only policy that's affected building energy efficiency at large scale is a good building code well enforced. If you build a great building, it's a 100-year asset. If you build a crappy building, it's a 100-year liability. It's very expensive to retrofit a building. And there's all kinds of fiddling on the edges, for example, with energy-efficient mortgages and labelings and things like that. But they don't deliver the large number of zeros you need to solve the climate problem. Energy efficiency standards for appliances and equipment is another home run. Fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks knocks it out of the park. Pricing carbon is incredibly important, as is desubsidizing fossil fuels. They're flip sides of the same coin. This is not a panacea, however. I have a son at the University of Chicago, and he may argue with me from time to time, but pricing carbon essentially has no impact on the building sector because the people who design and build buildings never pay the utility bills in those buildings, and has only a nominal effect on the transportation sector. It matters a lot for the industrial sector, and it can matter, depending on other regulations, in the electricity sector. It can also be ignored in the electricity sector, depending on how costs are passed through. The list of renewable portfolio standards is another example of a fantastically effective policy if it's well designed. So the list is compact. If you get these 10 policies right, you decarbonize the economy. It's that word getting them right that matters the most, though. And so I want to offer for your consideration a handful of characteristics that differentiate between good and terrible policy. And unfortunately, there's not much literature on this, and there's not much consensus on this, but bear with me for a moment and see what you think. The first is that policies should be performance-based. You have to define specifically what society's interest is: reliability, affordability, safety, and clean. Those are the core characteristics that people seek in the electricity sector, for example, in almost every sector. So your policy should reward those things. Rewarding investment is a bad idea. California used to have a very rich investment tax credit for windmills, and a lot of windmills were built that never spun. Rewarding capacity is another bad idea. China rewards capacity for renewable energy. Windmills get built, and they don't get hooked up. You met the standard, you checked off the box. Erwin Stelter, who's one of the fathers of deregulation, says all regulation is incentive regulation. And he's absolutely right. So you have to decide what society needs and wrap that up as your regulation. There's some interesting examples of this in the auto sector that I can get into if we have time afterwards. The second characteristic, which is a mirror of the first, is that policy should be price-finding rather than price-setting. And consider for a minute the contrast between a renewable portfolio standard run as an auction and a feed-in tariff. So the last solar PPA signed by the city of Austin came in at about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. The Japanese feed-in tariff for solar is 53 cents a kilowatt hour. And I'm telling you, one of those numbers is wrong. And if you pay too much, you get too little. And you also give a bad name for exactly that which you're trying to promote. It's nice to be generous to things you want to get going, but in the long run, that kind of generosity is just creating rent for the wrong people. It's not deploying what needs to be deployed. So policy has to be price finding, and there are some clever ways to do that, like reverse auctions, that we need to expand on. The third one is fairly straightforward and unfortunately often ignored, which is one needs some long-term certainty. Let me look at, we need, in order to have very large-scale renewables on our grid, which we need to get to and we can get to, there has to be some people who provide episodic power to meet those instances when the solar and wind variability kicks in. You might develop a specialized combined cycle gas turbine engine that can ramp quickly. Siemens and GE now have these technologies. They have high thermodynamic efficiency and fast ramp rates. They cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and you might run them 200 or 300 hours a year. You're not going to build that plant on a day-ahead or hour-ahead market for electricity. It's insanity to do that. So you need to have the ability for that kind of characteristic for a 10-year contract with some contract sanctity behind it. Or if you have a fuel efficiency standard for trucks, it takes years to design an engine, years to put it into production, years to saturate the market. So create a signal that's 15 years out and then stick with it. Long-term certainty is a home run. Most utilities will meet any standard you want to set if they're certain of it, because they can build their business models around it and they can build their R&D strategies around it. If you're on and off, like the production tax credit in America, you're just savaging the very industry you're trying to help. The third one, which is missed almost everywhere and which is incredibly powerful, is continuous improvement. Let me give the counterexample first. Gerald Ford in 1975 signed the fuel efficiency standards for cars in America, and they went from 13 miles per gallon average to about 24 or 25 miles per gallon average. So fuel efficiency in cars doubled in the next 10 years by 1985. They remained essentially flat until President Obama came into office. And now they're going to double again up to 54 miles per gallon. That flat period cost us over $1 trillion, most of which we sent to countries that don't like us, right? Incredibly dumb plateau. So why do you need continuous improvement? What does it look like? If instead President Ford had said our target for 1985 is 24 miles per gallon, and thereafter 3% a year, those few words would have saved us $1 trillion. And would have saved the auto industry, because they would have been innovating in those 25 years in engines and transmissions and aerodynamics and tires instead of cup holders. It's a big deal to have continuous improvement. The Japanese have a great approach. It's called the top runner system. They take a snapshot of things in the economy, like motors or lights or trucks. And they then take the top quintile of that population, and that's the floor for the next 4 years. And then they repeat the process. So guess what? You want to get into that top quintile. Everybody's racing to the top instead of racing to the bottom. Continuous improvement also solves a political problem, which is political bandwidth. So when Jerry Brown was the youngest governor in California's history, he passed Title 24, it's a building code. He put into that a clause that says that code will be tightened every 3 years based on any technology that pays for itself with a 7-year simple payback. That code has gotten tighter and tighter and tighter through Republican and Democratic administrations alike. It's not a political question anymore. He doesn't have to go to war. He's now the oldest governor in the history of California, and California buildings now use 80% less energy per square foot per degree day than they did pre-code. That's pretty cool. The California Public Utilities Commission has now said, we're going to zero net energy buildings for residential sector by 2020. That's also pretty neat. We wouldn't have gotten there without continuous improvement because it engendered a fantastic R&D and product deployment cycle. So continuous improvement is something, whenever you open the political door or the regulatory door, lock in continuous improvement. It's a winner. There's a couple others. Let me mention one more that I call investment grade policy. If you want to build a solar farm, you need to be price competitive. That might require a renewable portfolio standard or a reverse auction. But you also need a site. You need transmission lines. You need a PPA. You need a suite of characteristics that give you certainty that your dollars in are going to result in a project that cashes out. It's straightforward. And if any one of those variables is screwed up, if you don't have that kind of investment grade policy, that kind of regulatory certainty, you have to put a premium on that project because you don't know how it's going to work out or how long it's going to take to work out. So my environmental friends who have pushed the renewable portfolio standards so far need to expand their horizon a little bit and look at the whole suite of issues that make a policy investment grade or not. So let me stop with those 5 characteristics of performance-based goals, price-finding strategies, long-term outlet, continuous improvement, and investment grade policy. You can embed those in utility regulations, in building codes, in appliance standards, in the auto sector, and you get a dramatically better result across the board. I want to conclude with a suggestion for Paris. I'm breaking my rule here. I've worked in probably close to a dozen countries on energy policy, and I have found that almost none of them have the technical depth to make great policy. And that's because it's really hard. If you want to set a really good fuel efficiency standard for your cars, or your, let's say, trucks, it's even tougher, in your country, you need to know about the existing fleet. You need to know about existing technology. You need to know about tomorrow's technology. You need to know about prices. You need to think about inspection and maintenance and durability and warranties and fuel quality. Are the fuels in your country going to destroy the catalysts? You need to understand something about operator behavior. You might need to think about onboard diagnostics. There's a book of business you need to master, and you need a model of your fleet, which is not a trivial characteristic. You need to understand the difference between tractors and trailers and which part contributes how much. This turns out to be very hard. In my opinion, there's only 2 agencies in the world that know how to do this very well. I'm not going to name them because I'll probably make enemies. But we've seen that actually with Volkswagen. What happens if you fail? That was a failure across the board of getting regulatory policy right. There's a small number of groups who have, one for every sector, who have decided to focus intensively on getting it right. And they build a book of business on doing this, and they create spectacular economies of scale. So I'll mention a couple. The International Council on Clean Transportation has 40 engineers, attorneys, and economists. They know all the answers to all those questions I just raised. That's all they do. And they're available for free for any policymaker that wants a great fuel efficiency standard. And that's a home run. Dollars in, result out. There is no better investment that I've ever seen. So, and by the way, there are similar groups in industrial energy efficiency, in appliances, in transportation systems, and utility regulation, and buildings. These organizations actually don't fare very well at the philanthropic tables because they're not political. Well, what I always say is, if the door's open, for God's sake, walk through it, right? And so if you have countries around the world signing these INDCs, committing to reducing their carbon emissions, we need to make sure they have the advice to get the policy right. If they get the policy right, it unleashes the private sector. It aligns public institutions in the right direction. But it doesn't happen that easily. And the political window is small. People sign those INDCs, they go back home, and they're faced with all the day-to-day problems and crises that come their way. So one of the things I certainly hope will happen, and I've had some good conversations with a number of foreign ministries around the world, is that we establish some significant technical assistance on policy design so that we get these policies right. Let's make sure that we don't do all this effort and then end up with dribs and drabs of poorly designed policy afterwards, because then we will fail. If we get it right, it will do the opposite. It will engender the next technological dynamic, drive down prices, and spread the low-carbon economy much more rapidly. So, thank you. Quick questions. I know we had a bit of a late start, but... More coffee? Please.
Very good presentation. Where do we get a policy paper from you on that?
So we actually wrote a paper called Policies That Work, and if you go to energyinnovation.org, you can find it there. And we have a whole library there and references to some other great resources. It's not just a library, it's an annotated library by subject area, searchable even by decision maker. So you can, it's a fast way. But the core paper is called Policies That Work, and it's about 15 pages long and very consumable, I think. So. Anything else? All right. Oh, wait, over here. Two more. Ha. So the first thing about energy policy that drives me crazy is that people fall in love with a certain technology or a certain policy. And if you fall in love, you're not a very good judge. Right? That's the human experience. If you believe that carbon taxes will solve everything, then you've shut yourself out of about half the economy. And by the way, you've shut yourself out of about 90% of success so far. That doesn't mean they're not a great idea. They're a great idea. If you fall in love with solar, then you're not paying attention to energy efficiency and vice versa. So most people have a close to religious conviction or adherence to a certain policy or certain technology or certain mix. I've never understood why there are Republican technologies and Democratic technologies. I mean, for God's sake, what if there was Republican and Democratic medicine? You know, it's insane. We want cold beer, we want reasonable temperatures in our houses, and we want to get around. That's what we care about. Affordable, safe, clean, reliable. So, okay, next, there was one more question back here.
So recently, Mark Carney, the governor of Bank of England, has been making a lot of
Yes.
headway on financial policies.
Yep.
Climate change. Can you say a little bit about that?
So, this might get me into trouble in this crowd, but I'm old-fashioned, and I believe that capital finds returns. And anything you do to gimmick up that equation is just going to either create rent or create dead ends. So how do you make sure capital finds returns? You enunciate social goals. You make a clear path within those goals for capital to find returns. Now, I think Mr. Carney has done a fantastic job of raising the issue of risk. There's several kinds of, there's risk within an investment because of the investment grade policy ideas that I mentioned. There's fantastic economic risk with climate change. There was a great project called Risky Business, still underway, led by Hank Paulson, Republican former Treasury Secretary, Mike Bloomberg, independent former mayor of New York City, I think, and Tom Steyer, Bob Rubin, Henry Cisneros, Donna Shalala, and others. It was bipartisan or tripartisan. They looked at tail risks, which any investor does, instead of medians, which is what scientists do. And the tail risks for America are absolutely staggering, and I'll just give a couple examples. In the 20% risk range, about a quarter of the states reach a heat index that causes heat stroke if you're outside for more than an hour for 2 or 3 months out of every year. So stand up and be the politician that says, okay guys, here's our future. You don't get to go outside in June, July, and August. No baseball, no Little League, no running. It's a physiological problem if you get the heat and humidity up to a certain point. You cannot survive outside for more than an hour. We have a 20% risk of doing that to about 20 states in America. That's not a good thing. I read an article 2 weeks ago, I think in Science Magazine, that New Orleans and Miami are already condemned to be underwater based on existing baked-in temperature rise. So you want national security? Stand up and say you were responsible for that. And what about moving up the coast? You know, Richmond, Washington, Baltimore, New York, Boston. So these are very real threats, and a central banker should be concerned about that. So I think a risk-based analysis is an actually brilliant contribution to the opus. So, all right, I've gone over time. Thank you very much.
Hal, thank you very much. I think a couple of takeaways from your presentation. One, policy matters. Two, capital finds returns. And three, I need to get rid of my home in Miami. That's unfortunate. That's hard, though. The last one, I'm not sure I can forfeit. We are now moving on to a key point that Hal made, and that's capital finds returns. And so I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Sami Ben Jafar, who is going to talk about how some capital can find some returns and opportunities for you all. Sami is the Director of Private Sector Facility at the Green Climate Fund. And prior to joining the fund about a year ago, he spent quite a bit of time in the financial services sector, particularly in the Middle East. He was the head of strategy and chief of staff to the CEO of Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank. And he also was responsible for the business's turnaround in 2009, as head of the international wholesale banking part of the institution. He served as the executive director at the Noor Islamic Bank in the UAE prior to that, and also he was the person responsible for initiating Citibank Senegal's corporate social responsibility program, something that we at GSEI care about as well. So Sami, where's Sami? Come join us, please. Help me in welcoming Sami Ben Jafar.
Good morning, and thanks for coming out. I'm going to talk today about the Green Climate Fund and some of the things that we're doing. In particular, I know that there's breakout sessions after this regarding our upcoming request for proposal process, and I want to give you a brief introduction of where that comes from. We've received $10 billion in pledges over the last year, and that $10 billion is supposed to cover a wide scope of actions. They're supposed to be mobilized through debt, equity, guarantees, and grants across 8 large themes, everything from renewable energy to ecosystems. It's a wide scope, and it's a wide scope to cover with $10 billion in a world of finance that's estimated about $250 trillion. And so when you engage the private sector, there are 2 ways of doing it. One is through classical origination, reaching out to accredited partners, financial institutions, different organizations. And the other is to send a strong market signal. And how do you send that strong market signal? Where does the GCF see its money being mobilized? That market signal should also have a feedback loop incorporated into it, so that it's not a centralized view, but one that takes into account what the feedback of the private sector is. And that has been, the process for that has been identified as setting up requests for proposals. So one of the, sorry, they've got the wrong presentation here. So I'm just going to talk through this now and make my life easier and yours more interesting. So one of the strongest signals that was sent to the private sector to begin with was the creation of the private sector facility. And what that really told the market was the GCF is open to business and wants to talk a language that the private sector understands, and wants to have turnaround times that are aligned to what the private sector is used to. Not 22 months, not 66 months, but 6 to 12 months on the outside. And so in creating that, we keep a couple points in mind. What's in it for the private sector? Well, number one, energy efficiency is the first time in 10, 15 years that the global economy has a crack at making real economic gains rather than economic gains motored by monetary policy. And so it's a good business opportunity. The second one is this word that took me forever to understand when I joined the GCF, adaptation. What is adaptation? Well, adaptation is nothing more than risk mitigation. It's supply chain management. It's continuity of business risk management. And when contextualized in that framework, it's no longer a gimme that is being requested from philanthropists and governments. It becomes a core area of investment that needs to be addressed by the private sector. The previous speaker talked about New Orleans disappearing. Dubai is also on that list. Now, if Dubai disappears, it's inconvenient for the 4 million or so inhabitants that are there now, but it's going to affect all our lives because that's the largest export hub for Sony. And what investment does Sony need to make, whether that's in reallocating its logistical hubs or whether that's in So in designing the RFPs, two areas were identified. One is micro and small, medium-sized enterprises. And the reason those were identified was because they share a lot with climate. The first thing is that in emerging markets, a lot of the suppliers of technology, a lot of the suppliers of energy-efficient equipment, renewable energy equipment, are mid-cap and small players. The second thing that climate and MSMEs share in common is that they both face a financing gap. So there's a $2.5 trillion shortfall in the amount of debt that's available to MSMEs. And what we want to do is address both those through a request for proposal process that will flush out how to most effectively use what you've seen are extremely scarce resources, $10 billion in a pool of $250 trillion of financial markets. The second area that was addressed was mobilizing funds at scale. And so there's widespread debate as to whether mobilizing funds at scale means mobilizing pension fund money and insurance fund money because they represent about 30% of what's out there. What the market or what the climate finance world needs to understand is that oftentimes, more often than not, pension fund money and insurance money moves through instruments that are put together by banks, securities, bonds, commercial paper, liquid instruments. They do have non-liquid investments, but those are on the margin. And if we're talking about mobilizing funds at scale to make a paradigm shift, what you really want to get to is the 80% of their portfolio, not the 2% that's on the margin. So as you break out into your groups, one of the key questions we're looking to answer is what are the specific guidelines that we could provide to the private sector on what kind of investments proposals that they could bring forth to the GCF through these two RFPs. The guidelines need to be narrow enough that we cater to transparency. And what do I mean by that? If you know what you're bidding for, it's a very transparent process because then it becomes the rules of the game are known to everyone. What kind of SMEs do we want? Do we want big MSMEs, small MSMEs? Do we want financially viable MSMEs or very early venture MSMEs? But they cannot be so tight that the feedback loop breaks, so that they become very directive in nature. And it's a fine balance that needs to be struck, and that's what we're looking for in terms of feedback during the breakout sessions. That's it. Thank you very much.